Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever one is watching this Women's Parliament. The Women's Parliament, held here in Cambridge on Thursday, the 8th of December 2022, sits in Cambridge in order to demand that the world ends violence against women and that all women are able to claim, to establish, to have economic independence. We demand a Women's Bill of Rights. The motion that we are considering and debating today is that on Thursday, the 8th of December 2022, during the United Nations 16 Days to End Violence Against Women, in the shadow of the United Nations acknowledgement that every 11 minutes an intimate partner or family member kills a woman or girl, and that when killing by strangers or non-intimate partners or family members is included, every 5 minutes a man kills a woman or girl somewhere in the world. This Women's Parliament, one, stands together with the United Nations Secretary General in the initiative Unite by 2030 to end violence against women, and with the United Nations marking the 16 days under the theme Unite Activism to End Violence Against Women and Girls. Two, calls upon all governments, national, devolved and local, to take a leading role in ending violence against women, going beyond empty words and shibboleths to targeted, practical programs designed to work towards changing the dynamics that underpin violence against women in all its forms. Three, demands that all governments, national, devolved and local, and the private sector recognise concretely and effectively their responsibility and role in ending violence against women, particularly but not only in administration, business and employment practices which elevate male-dominant perspectives and conduct, seen most readily in sexual and sexist harassment, discriminatory appointments and promotion, organisation of the workplace into male and female jobs, and failure to address the pay gap and the pensions gap to ensure equal pay and equal pension or superannuation rights for women. Four, recognises that the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, outlaws both direct, unequal treatment and indirect, so-called equal treatment discrimination between women and men in all aspects of life, including in education and training, employment, facilities, goods and services, accommodation, membership and activities of clubs, administration of laws and programs, and the media, and that unless and until the provisions of CEDAW are fully and effectively implemented by introducing a Women's Bill of Rights, violence against women in all its forms will continue without a real effective chance of being ended. 5, notes that CEDAW was signed by the United Kingdom in 1981, ratified by the United Kingdom in 1986, the optional protocol agreed to by the United Kingdom in 2004, with ratification committing the government to advance, protect, promote and fulfil the human rights of women under all circumstances, including ending violence against women, the United Kingdom thereby giving an undertaking to incorporate the principles and provisions of CEDAW fully and effectively into domestic law. 6, observes that despite this commitment and undertaking, legislative recognition by domestication of CEDAW is not yet realised, and there remains no full and effective recognition and a legislative provision, nor substantive equality in practice between women and men in the United Kingdom today, in the absence of which women remain vulnerable to violence, including predatory and coercively controlling conduct at home, at work, in education, and in public places, including public transport, in accommodation, and in provision of services. 7, we note that violence against women is worsened by disastrous austerity measures introduced in 2010 and added to by successive governments, including the present government's budgeting, particularly but not only in relation to soaring energy costs, impacting particularly upon working class women, women with a disability, Black and minoritised women, older and younger women, so that few, if any, women are not differentially impacted by these measures, rendering them more vulnerable to violence in all its forms. 8 refers to the motion of the Women's Parliament passed unanimously on International Women's Day, the 8th of March 2022, endorsing its provisions, in particular, but not only, by reference to the Abortion Act 1967, which requires serious amendment, the Equal Pay Act of 1970, the Sexual Offences Act of 2003, the Equality Act of 2010, and the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021, which to some extent, though inadequately, provide increasing legislative recognition of the imperative to ensure equality for women and girls, which lies at the base of ending violence against women, but these acts do not. 9 demands recognition of women and girls' rights to just and effective laws in principle and in practice to end 1, vilification and misogyny, rape and other sexual offences, criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, marital murder and dishonour crimes, and the killing by women of a spouse or partner or former spouse or partner. This killing by women is not properly and effectively recognised in the law in the way that it should be. And women who are in prison convicted of murder in these circumstances have a right to demand a review of their cases. 2, we need to end online violence, exploitation, victimisation and abuse, stalking and all social media abuses, including vilification and misogyny. 3, sexual harassment, sexist harassment and bullying. These must be ended in all areas of life, with funding and resourcing of women's services, including services for Black and minoritised women, trafficked and prostituted women, asylum-seeking and refugee women, women with a disability and all disadvantaged groups of women at levels proper and appropriate for the care, support, protection and advancement to the independence of women, measured by reference to continuing inequality between women and men and the need for these women's services, including specialised services, to be funded to levels that acknowledge that inequality. 10, we demand recruitment practices, training and governance of police and all levels of the criminal justice system and of government, including national, devolved and local, be attuned to and focus on the need to eradicate misogyny and racism embodied in these institutions, and that they institute programs cognisant of and directed toward ending violence against women, including sexist and sexual harassment, appointments and promotion, organisation of the workplace into male and female jobs, and failure to address the pay gap and pensions gap to ensure equal pay and equal pension or superannuation rights for women. It's worth emphasising that twice. The pay gap has had some attention. The pensions gap is only now on the radar, and it needs to remain there until this wrong is remedied. We are concerned that all matters brought to attention by the CEDAW People's Tribunal sitting the 21st and 23rd of July 2021, incorporated into the President's report from that tribunal, and the CEDAW in Law People's Tribunal on the impact of the state pension age of accrual for women from 60 to 65 and then added to 66 and more, be addressed by the United Kingdom Government and insofar as the devolved authorities of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have power to do so, they also address these matters. 12 recognises that while progress can be made through legislation, the trade union movement needs to bring its organised strength to bear on the government and employers to see that CEDAW is implemented and violence against women is ended. Thus, this Women's Parliament calls on 1, the United Kingdom Government and devolved assemblies of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, insofar as the devolved assemblies are able to do so, 1, to acknowledge and honour the demands and concerns of the Women's Parliament referred to at paragraphs 1 to 12 hereof by implementation to end violence against women and girls and to advance women's economic independence, and 2, where paragraphs 1 to 12 refer to the private sector, police, the criminal justice system and institutions, take steps to ensure their implementation, including by transposing the provisions of CEDAW, including its general recommendations, into domestic law as a Women's Bill of Rights, incorporating the provisions of the Equality Act 2010 insofar as they relate to women and girls, implementing the recommendations of the CEDAW President's Report, ensuring effective and sustained monitoring of the implementation of the Women's Bill of Rights and other measures adopted as set out in the President's Report from the CEDAW People's Tribunal of June 2020. The trade union movement to support the campaign for the Women's Bill of Rights and implementation of the recommendations of the CEDAW President's Report and participating by taking whatever steps it can to ensure implementation of paragraphs 1 to 12 hereof, working to end violence against women and girls. And now that concludes the motion, and lest the watchers and those present be concerned, we are about to hear the voices of the Women's Parliament. But before doing so, it behoves me to introduce each of our Women's Parliament members. We have with us today Claire Reeve. Claire has worked in nurseries, schools and social services, Sure Starts and school library services in London and Middlesex as a children's and early years educational professional. She holds a BA degree in religion, human geography, sociology and creative writing. She's a passionate advocate of neurodiverse ADHD, autistic women and girls. She has a diagnosed autistic teenage daughter, and Claire is a self-diagnosed ADHD with autistic traits and 2 neurodiverse sons. Claire also has spina bifida with medically treated chronic pain, and her interests include a demand for more recognition for neurodiverse females to access desperately needed healthcare and support. Claire is currently writing a book. Dr. Davina Lloyd was the Back to 60 NGO representative at the UN CEDAW Committee in Geneva in 2018 and 2019, presenting the case for discrimination against 1950s born women. Since then, Davina has been on the steering committee for both the CEDAW and CEDAW in Law People's Tribunals and worked with the team bringing the evidence of discrimination and the need for a Women's Bill of Rights to Parliament's intention. Stephanie Palmer is 22 years old, a recent law degree finalist at the University of Buckingham. She was born and raised in Luxembourg, is multilingual, and is an aspiring solicitor to work in the field of domestic violence. Stephanie has just completed her final exams at the University of Buckingham, so will be graduating in the next cohort of students graduating from the University of Buckingham. Mrs. Eleanor Redshaw is a Girton graduate, yay for Girton. She taught for 40 years in various schools and became head of humanities at Greenacre School, Banstead, Surrey. Eleanor's grandmother was a suffragette who demonstrated, was arrested, and spent time in Holloway Prison, London. Eleanor has done research into women's suffrage using many sources, including the Kew National Archive and the Women's Library at LSE. And Eleanor has a wonderful photograph, which we will put up on the screen when we go to YouTube, a wonderful photograph of her grandmother being arrested. I think it's 3 burly police officers and a very slight woman being dragged away from the railings. A proud history. Dr. Myrna Guar is Senior Lecturer in Sociology at Anglia Ruskin University, Cambridge. Her research and teaching specialisms include gender violence, social justice and policy making, and international development. She has worked on violence against women and girls across a decade, first as a development practitioner in South Asia and currently through academic research in the United Kingdom. Myrna is currently working on research to explore the vulnerabilities of Asian women around domestic abuse in Cambridgeshire. She plans to expand the study to include the experiences of minoritised women from different backgrounds across East England. Anna Kavit is a visiting research fellow at the University College London, originally from Kiev, Ukraine. Her research experience covers empirical studies of gendered impacts of the war in Ukraine and of women in the military. Anna contributed to the development of the programs and policies on the implementation of women, peace and security agenda in Ukraine. She worked for international organisations and civil society organisations in Ukraine, holding a BA in sociology from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Ukraine. She also holds an MA degree in global political economy from the University of Kassel in Germany. Rebecca Dennis is a career civil servant of the National Archives, Government Office Network and Department for Education with a brief spell at Cambridge City Council. She was made redundant and she's since acquired a degree in psychology with OU and gone into politics as a Labor activist with a particular interest in the development of candidates. And Rebecca Dennis is also a councillor within Cambridgeshire. We pass now to Saffron. Saffron Anderton is a 22-year-old living in supported accommodation and has a diagnosis of autism. In July this year, Saffron Anderton graduated with a degree in politics. Good to have Saffron here. Baljit Banger. Baljit is Executive Director of IMCAN, established in 2012, working in marginalised and stateless communities, poverty and identity issues. She has, through IMCAN, a special focus on women and children with projects meant to empower and progress. IMCAN's projects provide services and support in legal services and empowerment, education, mother and child health, recreation and sports, legal protection, mental health, maternity, and a clean environment through waste management. Karolina Blaszczak is a Polish immigrant and mother of 2 kind human beings. She is working part-time and studying psychology. As a survivor of domestic abuse during childhood and in adult life, Carolina is passionate about raising awareness of how patriarchy, inefficient law and policy making ruin the lives of women, men and children. Knowing the importance of creating a community to the best of her abilities, she supports victims and survivors. Her dream is to see how humanity thrives through disposing of inequality and cultivating mental health. Chiquita Outerbridge is a recent graduate of the University of Buckingham. Her degree is in digital news and media with a minor in law. She is passionate about women's and children's rights, particularly in the family court setting. Chiquita hopes to use her media background while pursuing her legal education to work with organisations to advocate for change. Chiquita enrolled in one of the subjects I teach at the University of Buckingham. It was sex, gender and minorities, but this was at a level above the level she was at the time. So she came then to my introduction to criminology course, and then in the next term, when she passed all the subjects in that diet, she came back into sex, gender and minorities. So it's good to have Chiquita in both those law subjects. Janet Robertson is a Master of Science and a BA and also an FRSA, the BA with honours. She is a creative producer, director and project manager, completed the first year of her doctorate researching cultural policy. She is interim Chief Executive Officer of Action for Children's Arts, founder and chair, CEO of SNAP Early Years, worked with organisations including Really Useful Group, BBC, Scottish Opera, the National Youth Music Theatre. She founded the Scottish Youth Music Theatre. She's based in Cambridge. Her husband is a composer. She has 2 children, both professional opera singers, and she's an activist with the Labor Party. Ana Serena Delgado is a Spaniard, a free thinker and a fervent feminist who landed in the United Kingdom 11 years ago. She dedicated herself to the social and care sector until 4 years ago, when she decided to change the world and study politics at Anglia Ruskin. So far, the world is not getting any better, but Ana is persistent and hopeful that we can achieve change. She is now coordinating the Ask Me project at Cambridge Women's Aid, delivering free training to the community about domestic abuse and how to challenge how we speak about domestic abuse and violence against women. We create change, says Anna, by educating the community and changing the way society speaks about domestic abuse and violence against women. Julie O'Shea is Clinical Education Manager at the University of Buckingham, working with undergraduates and postgraduate law students to explore vocational work experience in legal services and the charities sector. And Julie O'Shea is now in charge, effectively, of the new module that has been introduced at the University of Buckingham, so that the clinical education program that students originally underwent voluntarily, purely pro bono with no credit, will now gain credits so that they can do that subject as a recognised part of their university degree. And that's to a great extent, thank you to Julie for all her work in ensuring that that program was established and the transition has come about. Linda Edwards-Shea became a feminist at the age of 15 when her father died and she witnessed the obstacles her mother had to get over in order to become financially independent. Linda is an ex-chartered physicist and chartered engineer. She worked in the man's world of research and development in aerospace and electronics industries before becoming an academic, teaching physics to engineers. After 15 years, she left and is now an actor and playwright. She is a waspy woman, having had her state pension pinched by the government with no notice. As a result of that injustice, she turned to politics and is currently the mayor of a town council in rural Lincolnshire. Just as a quick background, in 1995, the State Pension Act was changed, brought in an effective change so that the age when women gained the pension at 60 would go up to the age when men gained the pension at 65. It was put forward as an equalisation measure, but there's no doubt that the way that the measure was implemented, even if it could be accepted as a legitimate government measure, was disproportionate in that it impacted only on women born in the 1950s, in that they were the cohort that suffered the blunt edge of this change and have suffered thereby direct discrimination. Dr. Cynthia Chisholm Azuliki is a human rights lawyer, activist and lecturer in law, formerly with Birkbeck University, London, and now the University of Buckingham. She has a double master's degree in law from Queen Mary University, London, a PhD from Birkbeck University, and she's focused on intersections of human rights law, medical law, and ethnicity. She is the founding director of Human Rights in Fashion Centre, London, and convener of the International Conference on Human Rights, Sustainability and Climate Change. Her interests focus on climate change and as a human rights issue, specifically impact on socioeconomic welfare and living conditions of humans. Cynthia previously worked as Global Head of Legal and Governance at Diamond Hanger Aviation. She is currently she independently consults for third sector organisations on best practice initiatives in applying human rights due diligence to supply chains. Kate Viscardi is a retired university lecturer in engineering and now an occasional contributor to the East Anglia bylines. Google East Anglia bylines and you'll find really interesting, valuable stories, timely. Before that, Kate was head of the Women Engineering Centre, having been lead researcher on women in engineering for the Engineering Industry Training Board. And now to Natalie Turney, who is a lecturer in law at the University of Buckingham, her principal areas of expertise being company and insurance law, and she is a keen speaker on corporate social responsibility. Recently, Natalie appeared in Zurich for the International Insurance Law Association to discuss corporate environmental responsibility, and she became a member of the Women's Parliament earlier this year on the 8th of March 2022 to discuss the importance of representation of women in companies and in corporate policies and decision making. So I think that that's the list that we've got at the Women's Parliament today. I therefore turn now to the voices of the Women's Parliament here in Cambridge on the 8th of December 22. And I would invite Eleanor Redshaw to introduce the Women's Parliament speakers. Thank you.
My great pleasure to be opening the debate today. This time I am dressed as a suffragist in their colours of red, white and green. The suffragists started asking for votes for women in 1866, when the first mass women's suffrage petition was presented to government, long before suffragettes came on the scene. In 1867, Sir John Stuart Mill led the first debate in Parliament on women voting. to no avail. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed in 1896, amalgamating 449 groups, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett became their leader. She is depicted on the first female statue in Parliament Square, unveiled in 2018, and I was there that day. The suffragists believed in the power of persuasion, lobbying MPs, peaceful demonstrations, rather than forcing the issue with violence. They aimed the common cause, and the suffragists held meetings in their homes. But the working class women could not attend these because they were in the factory, or teaching, or in service in a big house. Well-dressed ladies spoke at larger gatherings in public halls and open spaces. Only in the early 20th century did the women take to the streets for their famous parades. In February 1907, the NUWSS held the Mud March, when 3,000 women took part in the largest open-air demonstration ever held. In 1913, the suffragists embarked on an astonishing 6-week protest called the Great Pilgrimage. Rich and poor, young and old, defied convention, risking jobs and family relationships, to walk from 16 different areas around the UK to London, to persuade the country to listen to them. Other famous campaigning suffragists were Lydia Becker, Ray Strachey, Eleanor Rathbone, and Mary Lowndes, who created the banners for their marches. Eleanor Beatrix Higginson, who was born into a very poor family in the East End of London, said that asking politely for votes of women had achieved nothing. So in 1907, she decided to join the suffragettes. I knew her well. Married with 2 young children when she became secretary of the new Preston branch of the Women's Social and Political Union. Annie Kenny, a mill worker and famous suffragette, asked Grandma if she was prepared to make the sacrifice of going to prison in aid of the Votes for Women campaign. Eleanor was one of 8 active suffragettes in Preston. She demonstrated in her hometown and painted the local statue of Lord Derby with tar. In 1913, Grandma gate-crashed a meeting at the public hall where Winston Churchill was due to speak. Once she had started, she stood up and shouted, "Votes for women!" So the stewards tried to evict her. Eleanor chained herself to the seat, and unceremoniously, she and the chair were hurled out into the street. Her grandma was arrested for throwing a brick through a window at the Red Lion pub in Whitehall in London, which is the nearest inn to the Houses of Parliament and much frequented by politicians. Nellie got 4 months in jail for that. May the 21st, 1914, Eleanor joined Emmeline Pankhurst and 200 other women in a procession down Constitution Hill to present another huge petition to King George V at Buckingham Palace. They were mounted policemen and rough Whitechapel police with their batons drawn. The gates were, and the march became a riot. This is the famous newspaper photograph of my grandmother being arrested by 4 policemen, 1 mounted policeman. Next day, the suffragettes would not cooperate. Grandma was given a fine of £5 or 1 month in jail, but the women never paid their fines. In Holloway Prison in London, she was held in isolation as a second-class criminal prisoner and decided to do the hunger and thirst strike. After this, Eleanor suffered forcible feeding, i.e. gruel was poured into her stomach using a metal funnel while she was tied down to a chair. Grandma was released under the Cat and Mouse Act, and I have her discharge papers, which allowed her to go home for 2 weeks to recover as a mouse. The government, i.e. the cat, sent 2 policemen to Preston to re-arrest her, returning her to Holloway. Out on August the 4th, and Eleanor never went back to fulfill her sentence. The Regulation of the People Act 1918 gave some women the franchise. They had to be over 30 and be property owners. It took them 67 years of campaigning to achieve that. Eleanor Higginson went through hell, along with 1,300 suffragettes who were arrested and many jailed. Emily Wadding Davison sacrificed her life in order to promote votes for women on an equal basis with men. But started earlier than the suffragettes, and they actually went on longer during World War II, continuing their campaign for votes for women. That was 100 years ago, and we still have a long way to proceed, so I support the motions.
Thank you, Eleanor. And now I'd like to invite Janet Robertson to address the Parliament.
Thank you. I would like to address the issue of women's financial independence. So the barriers to financial independence faced by women in our society are complex, as we've heard here today. It's a fundamental need to live a fulfilled and positive life that everyone deserves to do. Financial independence is fueled, or lack of it, is fueled by a lack of equality, of opportunity, of accessible education, of job security, of low-paid work driving debt reliance, of our biology and our dependence on partners, and the social expectations within our communities for women to fulfill caring responsibilities that drive us to compromise our lives, and by extension, often our children's futures. I'd like to focus on the inflicted on women who need to access childcare in the UK as a whole, but more specifically in England. Women who need this choice. Can I afford to work? To contribute to its well-being, where employers are crying out for staff across almost every sector, this is a shocking question. It's a question with one constant, sharp, clear driver: the exorbitant costs of childcare, of early years provision in the United Kingdom. Childcare is now usually more expensive than our monthly rent or our mortgage payments, With levels of rent increases and hikes in those payments we have had to endure in recent months and years, that statement has a profound resonance. The narratives from online blogs like Mumsnet, the lobbying group Pregnant Then Screwed, to every national newspaper in the land and even the BBC, all call out the unfairness of this cost burden and the limitations it puts on women. But they never seem to unpick why the costs are as they are. Why do we have some of the highest childcare fees anywhere in the world? I believe I have an insider understanding of the truth of that, because long ago I had small children, well, about 20 odd years ago, and as a freelance arts professional, my childcare budget was tiny. But I did find an excellent nursery in Cambridge. It was in fact the first nursery in the city, founded by women trained by Maria Montessori, and it supported the very first women who came here to study. And that nursery provided me with affordable and excellent childcare. When the lady who then ran it decided to retire, as the arts mum who'd volunteered support there, and as the artist with no budget whatsoever to find anywhere else, it was easiest for me and my husband to take over the business and keep it going. We did that, and it's continued to grow across the region in the past 23 years. So I have a good view of the issues here. The core of the problem, then, sits squarely with government. The front line of early years care provision in the UK has been underfunded by successive governments for decades, while the costs of the sector have faced and seen an exponential rise. The very existence of good, local, reliable childcare that's not delivered by a corporate giant is under threat, with hundreds of private, voluntary and independent early years settings closing in every area of the UK every week of the past year. The options for women to find the care they need are rapidly disappearing. Let me break down what that funding means. And for much of this detail here, I must thank Cheryl Hadland, the Chief Executive and founder of the Tops nursery chain. Cheryl made an excellent presentation at a very recent Westminster All-Parliamentary Party group on childcare and early education. And it's from that I offer you these facts and figures that help illustrate the problem. So the costs that are faced. Settings in Wales and Scotland are exempt from business rates. Not so in England. Here we have to find between 14 and 16,000 on average per year to cover those rates. Wage costs for early year staff have increased by around 21% over the past 3 years, just to keep up with market forces and the ever-decreasing pool of human resources. The Consumer Price Index puts inflation about 9.9%, while overall early years costs have gone up by 14.2% year on year in the last 3 years. And then we have the comedy of the utilities. This year, gas costs are 330% higher and electricity 373% higher than the year before. It's almost unimaginable. Private, voluntary and independent childcare settings have no ability to charge VAT. Good for parents, that would make the bills higher, but we have to pay VAT and we cannot claim it back. They will not classify us in a way that makes it available to us. On the other side, then the funding. Free childcare is on offer. Funding for the early years sector could be entitled Why the Free is Not Free. The government offers private, voluntary and independent early years settings around £5.17 to £5.69 per hour for 2-year-olds that qualify, and £4.15 to £4.52 per hour for 3-year-olds plus. The maintained sector, meanwhile, is paid between £6 and £8 an hour for the same service per pupil. They have no business rates, they are exempt from VAT, they have limited hours of opening, they have capital funding and investment in their sustainable infrastructure. We have none of that. Why is this so unfair? Every single free hour is underfunded for every single child who claims it. So settings have no option other than to find ways to make up that loss, resulting in high charges to parents. It's a government-made problem. Government is paying its own maintained sector. So if you like, it's paying itself 50% more than it offers the private and voluntary sector for the same 3 hours. That loss is over £2,000 per year per child. So a small setting with maybe 20 children claiming the 3 hours needs to make up £800 per year just to stay afloat. And that's not counting the impact of the VAT and the business rates, etc. Childcare charges are at the levels they are because government is not paying its share of the costs. The offer it makes to parents actually impacts on any business. It's not paying those costs. And women are the victims of this unfair and damaging approach. It's not the providers who are making the hedge fund manager profits. That's not a true thing at all. It's an unjust system that keeps the wages of women working in it within it depressed, and the fees charged to the women who seek to use the service overinflated. These rates offered to the private, voluntary and independent sector have not kept up with inflation, and while record investment in early years has often been heralded as evidence of government commitment to the sector, more money is not the same as enough money. We need honest conversations and positive action to implement the simple solutions needed to fix this. Balance the funding fairly. Cut the early years business rates obligations in England. Make early years zero rated for VAT. There's so much evidence already available to support these changes, they would not be difficult to enable if the will to support women was real. If that was real, they would have been made years ago. Other countries make such a success of their early years provision. Why can't we? We need to implement a Women's Bill of Rights now. It's our legal obligation and our government needs to be held to account. I support this motion.
Thank you, Janet Robertson. Thank you. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Natalie Turney. Thank you, Natalie.
Staggering towards a dangling payment card, the card is snatched from a woman before she heads towards the door. But she's pulled back, not by a person, but by chains restraining her ability to move free from control. When an abuser controls your finances, they control you. These are the words that can be heard on HSBC's most recent television advertisement, in narration to this harrowing but familiar scene. In the advert, the chains are visible, and the woman moves beneath them like a puppet on a string. In reality, the chains are invisible, but women remain shackled to those upon whom they rely to sustain their lives financially. We have long lived in a society where women are financially dependent on men, and over time, the number of female dependents has decreased. With the opening of more jobs and industries to women, female wage earners have become normalised. But the very recent COVID-19 pandemic imposed turbulent circumstances on so many. According to a 2021 House of Commons Library Insight report, between only April and June 2020, there was a 65% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline when compared to the first 3 months of that year. Such calls refer to domestic abuse generally, but include financial abuse. The pandemic disproportionately impacted women in their own careers in comparison to men. The European Institute for Gender Equality published in 2021 that women were overrepresented in roles deemed to be key work, thus resulting in decreased flexible working arrangements and greater exposure to health threats. Studies published by UN Women and by McKinsey set out that female employment not only fell at a greater rate than in comparison to men, but the burden of unpaid work increased. Women leaving employment in order to take up unpaid care roles, for example, for children, increased, and as a result, financial dependency upon male wage earners increased in turn. It is imperative that this disproportionate impact be recognised and companies work to ensure that this is not a continuing legacy of the pandemic. Access to meaningful and accommodating employment for women is all the more crucial. But the issue of financial dependency does not stop there. For some time, the gender pay gap has been recognised as a source of inequality between men and women in employment. According to figures released through the government's gender pay gap reporting system in early 2022, on average, women are paid 90 pence to men's earned £1, where the average increases for women is typically due to an overrepresentation of women in lower paid industries, such as health and social care. And there are many contributing factors to this, such as career breaks, often taken by women who leave employment to raise children. With this delay in progress and development often comes financial reliance, and with this interruption to wage earning, we see disruption to pension payments, which may follow comparatively smaller pension payments, leaving women in a more vulnerable position in later life and exposing women to old age poverty. Now, companies are already largely forced into some sense of self-awareness when it comes to confronting the gender pay gap. As of 2017, employers with a headcount of over 250 must comply with regulations in respect of gender pay gap reporting. And in making the report, there is the option to provide a supporting narrative and employer action plan. Arguably, this introspective measure could and should become compulsory. It's already the case that many companies publish their gender pay gap data alongside some measure of explanation. HSBC's recent advertisement, in collaboration with domestic abuse support charities Hestia and No More, is a great example of the good that companies can achieve in taking corporate social responsibility. As part of the UK Says No More campaign, safe spaces can not only be found in HSBC, but also TSB banks, Boots, Superdrug, Morrison's, Well pharmacies, and hundreds of UK independent pharmacies. Provide safe spaces for vulnerable persons, for vulnerable women dependent upon others for basic commodities is vital. And in a cost of living crisis heading into a cold winter could prove to be a lifeline. Companies must rise up to their social responsibilities and utilise their power to be a source of empowerment for those so desperately in need. I support the motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Natalie Turney. And now may I call on Karolina Vlaschek, please, to present. Thank you.
Good morning. Today I would like to give an account of my personal experience of domestic violence to raise awareness about the impact it has on victims and survivors. I wake up from the nightmare and I sit up startled. My damp from sweat nightgown clings to my body and my heart is pounding in my chest almost painfully. I muster the courage to check if the main door is locked for the second time this night. Holding my breath, I reach out for the metal door handle, which doesn't budge. I feel instant relief. I sigh loudly and place my forehead on the cold surface of the door. I peek through the peephole. The corridor is empty and peaceful. Still shaking, I go to check up on my daughter. Her night lamp illuminates her rapidly growing pre-teenage body. She's wrapped as a burrito in her blanket. I can't see her face, but I see her calm breathing, and I am trying to match my inhales and exhales with her steady rhythm. She's safe, and I am safe. I want to curl up next to her like our cat does every night, but I know her single bed is too small for both of us. I close the door carefully and go to look at my sleeping son. There is just 1 year difference between him and his sister, but he seems so much younger, so fragile. I climb next to him and cling to his warm back. I am searching for his slim, long hand with a birthmark on the back of his palm that will reassure me that this is real. He still has this wonderful smell of childhood. He embraces my hug barely noticeably without waking up. I need his peacefulness to be able to fall asleep again. Slowly, I begin to drift off, repeating in my head, the door is locked. We are safe here. I am having scary dreams far less often, ever since we managed to escape his coercive control trap. Escape the very person that was supposed to love and protect us. This monstrosity of coercive control is embedded so deeply in our society that is often mistaken for masculinity and commitment. Getting equipped to fight it is exhilarating. Bringing self-awareness for women and men, the better world for everyone. My children can sleep peacefully now. Their worries finally revolve around their childhood dilemmas and arguments about who is going to choose a movie this time or get one more slice of cake. I am studying and volunteering. I have completed my therapy. It helped me make sense of everything that happened and move on. Many think the word toxic is overused, and toxic masculinity is a figment of the imagination of entitled women who have too much time to spare. Your mother doesn't care about our family, and her friend is all that matters, he would repeat constantly to our children when he felt jealous and insecure. In turn, when he was trying to manipulate me into getting back together, he was so charming. His texts would try to convince me I'm the most kind and amazing person. He will change. He will do anything to make us happy. The pattern was clear. He liked to show up unexpectedly and to not appear when he was supposed to spend time with our children. His disregard for disappointment and anxiety he will create in them was ostentatious. Another tool to take away my freedom. My worries crystallized into a year-long court battle for my children's right to be free of using them to punish my disobedience. My truth was validated through terror of sleepless nights, decoding laws, and unearthing evidence. Amounts of stress that made everyday functioning hell again. He disappeared once for all as soon as he couldn't make the rules anymore. The chance to spend time with the children in a healthy way without space for coercion and abuse was not something he was interested in. Now my flashbacks come and go. Are my boundaries dissolving again? Did I fail to notice? Do I let myself get sucked in again in a guilt game with a toxic dominator? I keep reminding myself that he wasn't always abusive, and I didn't choose to be abused. I didn't ask for it, and I didn't force him to abuse me, as my surroundings led me to believe. I tried to help him to fight his demons, but society's programming and stigma was too strong for both of us for far too long. It wasn't love, as some of our family and friends tried to persuade me, perpetuating victim blaming. Has he ever hit you? I've been asked. He never has, I would answer, and wonder, was that supposed to be proof of his love? Would that be enough? Bruises? A broken bone? Why then I was scared to come back home after the dark? Not because of strangers, but because of him and his assurances that there is nothing to be afraid. Drugs and neglecting his mental health, there was never enough. Luckily, there were people around us who offered help and clearly saw the peril we were in. They are still standing by me today, no matter how far away they are. Services to escape domestic abuse worked well enough this time, but there is so much more work to be done. I was fortunate to be born white in the right part of the world in the right time with just enough money. That is a lot of luck. Every day I go over the coercive control science checklist in my head, like I used to go over rosary beads when I was praying in my childhood for peace, safety, and happiness. There was no divine intervention then. No one came. This time, I am here for myself and for my children. I was able to find our safe haven. I feel grounded in my awareness. I am finally able to wake up from the nightmares that don't withstand a sunrise. My children don't drink his poison anymore. I have my community of survivors, kind, strong, and passionate human beings. We understand you. We see you. We are here to embrace you. Thank you, and I support this motion.
And thank you. Thank you, Carolina Blazechek. Thank you. And now let's go to Linda Edwards-Shea. Linda.
Thank you. This Women's Parliament is focusing on violence against women and girls and on women's financial independence, or lack of it. The two are inextricably linked, and it's been reported that domestic abuse and violence increased during COVID lockdowns and has also increased as the current cost of living crisis hits. Today, I'm wearing a purple ribbon to remember a young woman who lived near me. Her name was Diana. In May of this year, she was murdered by her male partner. This act of violence was not perpetrated in the middle of a sink estate in an inner city hellhole, the like of which we see in the more lurid imaginings of blockbuster gangster movies. Indeed,
This act of violence was perpetrated in a quiet street in a small market town in the middle of rural Lincolnshire. That violent act was widely reported in the press as a murder-suicide because after murdering her, Diana's partner killed himself. I find the term murder-suicide troubling. People were shocked and appalled, of course, that such a crime could happen here in our beautiful small town. But where is here when it comes to violence against women? There is no one here because, of course, it happens everywhere. We are living through a pandemic of violence against women. The opening paragraph of the motion we are discussing today states that every 11 minutes, an intimate partner or family member kills a woman or girl. Every 11 minutes. Just think about that for a moment. In the time it takes for us to hear one or two short speeches, a woman or girl will have been murdered by a partner or relative. Women who are victims of this terrible crime are being murdered by people they know, and those people are usually men. Murder of this nature is surely the ultimate act of misogyny. The paragraph goes on to state, when killing by strangers or non-intimate partners or family members is included, every 5 minutes a man kills a woman or girl somewhere in the world. Every 5 minutes. That equates to over 100,000 deaths a year. When I described these extreme acts of violence against women and girls as a pandemic, I meant it. As a nation, we witnessed the aftermath of the murder of Sarah Everard by a male stranger. He happened to be a serving police officer at the time, and consequently, police forces have come under more scrutiny as a result of this one violent act than ever before. Would that scrutiny have occurred if women in their hundreds and thousands had not taken to the streets? In the case of the murder of Sarah Everard, women met on Clapham Common in London as a tribute to Sarah and to protest against her murder. That peaceful vigil turned into a nightmare when the police arrived and broke up the crowd, dragging women away and arresting them. Thus, an incident of extreme violence against an individual woman led to violence against many women. Where does this misogyny stem from? I believe misogyny is built into our societal norms. I do not mean that it's normal to murder, but I mean misogyny is long-standing and embedded in our cultural life. In other words, I'm suggesting it's part of our culture. It's a historic norm that we've hung onto. I believe there's a scale of misogyny, from extreme violence at one end to casual everyday sexism at the other. How is it that here in the UK we had the Equal Pay Act in 1970, yet 50 years later we still don't have equal pay? How is it that women fleeing domestic violence can lose their homes? Why are perpetrators allowed to keep their homes, but the victims are not so privileged? Why do we as a society condone so much domestic abuse or turn a blind eye to it instead of arresting, prosecuting, convicting and punishing the perpetrators? Why is that? There's clearly something wrong somewhere. Why are women who are victims of domestic abuse, including coercion, being chased by councils for council tax, even though the victims have left their abusive partners and no longer live in their home? Why are victims of domestic abuse and violence being evicted? Doesn't the abuse ever end? It's systemic. Example of systemic misogyny in the UK is the clandestine theft of 1950s born women's state pensions by our government. By clandestine, I mean that this theft was carried out in virtual secrecy. I use the word theft because money was taken off 3.8 million women without properly informing them, asking them, or consulting them. The amount of money taken off these waspy women is colossal. Most 1950s born women have had over £50,000 taken off each of them by the rise in state pension age from 60 to 65 and then to 66. Don't forget, these women were not consulted in advance. They had no choice, and most were given very little or no notice. I had no communication whatsoever from government that my state pension age was going to go up, not once, but twice. My family members did not know. My husband did not know. My friends did not know. My colleagues did not know. The fact is, we did not know. The reason we did not know was because we were not told. I note in passing that this sex discrimination was ruled to be lawful. Why weren't women told? We can only speculate. Is it because the perpetrators of this particular act of misogyny back in 1995 with the Pensions Act were a small group of male cabinet ministers in a parliament with only one or two female cabinet ministers? What was the reason women were not told? Weren't the women important enough? The WASPI pension theft has led to impoverishment, destitution, and sadly, suicide. It would be interesting to hear from the then Prime Minister John Major why, in 1995, it was thought to be okay not to tell those on the receiving end of that legislation. What was so astonishing at the time was the ridicule and derision heaped on the 1950s born women. From social media to the floor of the House of Commons, we were repeatedly told we were lying. This was a common allegation when we 1950s born women asked for redress because we had not been told. One MP stood up in the chamber of the House of Commons and essentially said his wife was okay, therefore the clandestine state pension age rise was okay too. Every pensions minister since the formation and rise of the WASPI movement and campaign group has said the women were told. We were not. From my observations over decades of the way women in the UK are disadvantaged has led me to one conclusion. Misogyny is here and it's in our own government. There is institutionalised misogyny within the UK government. Enough is enough. We need CEDAW to be fully implemented. We need a Women's Bill of Rights now. I support the motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda Edwards-Shea. And I now call upon Saffron Anderton to address the Parliament.
My name is Saffron Anderton, and I would like to talk about violence against women and girls while also touching on the topic of economic independence, but specifically in reference to autism and other neurodivergences. I was diagnosed as autistic in November 2020. Late diagnosed and misdiagnosed women and girls means that some don't get the support they need. And I am an example of the benefits that my diagnosis has given me. I am choosing to talk about both of these topics because I personally have connection to them both and feel it is vital for me to speak on these issues. I am only 22 years old. The 13 of these years was spent being emotionally abused every day, every morning, every night by my stepdad. At the age of 7, I was called derogatory names and every swear word under the sun. I was blamed for ruining people's birthdays and family events, and everything would be my fault. I was a defenseless child. For example, I was often compared to my younger sister who wasn't autistic and criticised for not knowing better and not behaving to his standards. No one came to my rescue. I had no one to protect me. Although I was undiagnosed, nothing can excuse his behaviour and his abuse of me and my different way of thinking. He wanted me to think like he did. He would lecture me on not speaking suitably to his standards despite my adamant protest that I just couldn't. He was constantly frustrated with me when I couldn't do something or my behaviour didn't match with what he thought I should understand and be able to do. This lecturing would escalate to a one-sided argument of verbal abuse with often the threat of violence. It wasn't until 2015 when one of my teachers in Year 10 became concerned that something wasn't quite right with me regarding my home life. Unfortunately, I was subjected and traumatised unnecessarily due to not having an earlier diagnosis of autism. A quote from Spectrum 2020. Many people with autism experience a triad of trauma: neglect at home, abuse from trusted adults, and bullying at work or school. Imagine that. Everywhere you go, you are at constant risk of verbal abuse or emotional hurt. just as I was at home by my stepdad and bullied at school. But just as important, this happens in interactions in society as well. When I received a copy of my autism diagnosis report, it stressed that I was a vulnerable adult due to not being able to process situations correctly. Of course, this will vary for all autistic people, but the general thinking is that we are more at risk because we cannot fully process people's intentions. I am logical, naive, and gullible. I don't understand humour or sarcasm. I am therefore at risk of being manipulated, taken advantage of, and being emotionally distressed. This is why violence against women and girls needs to also recognise those with other learning disabilities and neurodivergences. I know that my reaction is to freeze, hence the vulnerability. I know that I also become less protected when I wear my headphones. How would I know if someone is coming up behind me or following me? My headphones keep me safe from sensory stimulation, but puts me in danger of being defenseless. I have to protect myself, not only as a woman, but as an autistic person. Moving into adulthood, I'm starting to heal from my trauma. I have managed to move out of the family home and now in supported living. I continue to experience a huge sense of injustice about the toll this has taken on me emotionally. I have a degree in politics, which I am proud of. My CV says that I am autistic, yet I face a backlash by people who tell me to not state that I am autistic. I absolutely disagree. One shouldn't have to hide their autism. Autism is impossible to disguise. In my current search for employment, I tick a lot of boxes on inclusivity and diversity, but autism is still being stereotyped in the workplace. In 2021, the Office of National Statistics published data on employment, which shows that the disability employment gap is wider for autistic people, with only 28% in employment compared to people with a disability of 53%. It is correct that not all autistic people can or want to work, but many do. I am one of those people. Society needs to continue getting past their judgment and views on autistic people in the workplace. I'll finish by saying that this is my story. Not all autistic people will match my views or experiences, but I am one of many autistic people that want society to progress, to accept, and to look at the perspective of the autistic person in regard to mainstream conversations, and especially to not dismiss autistic women and girls. We are here. I support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Saffron Anderton, and thank you too to Claire Reeve for making sure that we could have Saffron here today, bringing her to our attention. Thank you. And now let's hear from Dr. Myrna Gua. Myrna, thank you.
Everyone. Let me set the context for you. The latest data from the crime survey for England and Wales shows that 2.3 million adults are affected by domestic abuse. Among this, minoritized women, or particularly women from ethnic minorities, experience higher levels of domestic abuse. A fact sheet from the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls highlights that minoritized women are thrice as likely to commit suicide as a result of domestic abuse. It is a grim context. If we look at the latest report by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner released only a few weeks ago, it highlights that minoritized women report feeling twice likely as safe compared to other women when they are able to access specialist by and for services. What are specialist by and for services? These are services that are provided to women from particularly marginalized communities with particularly complex vulnerabilities. But more importantly, these are services run by women from these communities. They are culturally competent, they are sensitive to various and intersecting needs of the victims, and they make victims feel supported and that they can come forward. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner report also highlights, unfortunately, that in a landscape of already underfunded and overwhelmed community-based services, these services are 6 times less as likely to receive statutory funding compared to their generalist counterparts. What we are seeing, therefore, is an opening up, an absence of life-saving vital support that is required by women from vulnerable sections in society. Now, services, and particularly why do minoritized women need specialist services? If we look at research from across the country that engages with victims' experiences and brings these forward, we find that minoritized women experience multiple intersecting barriers. These barriers exist within their families and communities, but they also exist in the outside world. Families and communities pressure minoritized women to stay silent, to not speak up about abuse. It's a private matter, don't talk about it. There is stigma around divorce in a lot of minoritized communities, but there is also the fear that victims have that when I step out of the community and I seek help, I will not be understood. Research shows time and time again that when minoritized women seek out support from generalist and statutory services, they are misunderstood, they feel judged, and they are racially and culturally stereotyped. This is confirmed in my own research, which is ongoing, with particularly Asian women and their vulnerabilities on domestic abuse in Cambridgeshire. As part of the research, I spoke to 15 women from Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi backgrounds across Cambridgeshire. These women experienced tremendous barriers within their communities and families. They were told time and time again not to speak up, yet they sought help. However, when they did reach out, they felt judged, they felt misunderstood, they felt that their experiences were not listened to and that solutions were imposed on them rather than taking their experiences into consideration. I'll give you an example of such an instance. And this connects to our discussions around economic abuse and financial independence, the need for financial independence for women in the UK today. When I spoke to British Pakistani women from Peterborough, these were women who were born and brought up in the UK. They are educated here. They have access to social and cultural and economic capital. Some of them are property earning. They have jobs. And often these women marry men who come from abroad. And this is quite common in diaspora communities in England because transnational marriages are seen as a way to extend communities' access to global resources. These women, despite all the presence of cultural and economic and social capital in their lives, experienced abuse in their marriages. They could not leave. They felt trapped. They felt trapped because they had financially invested a lot into maintaining these marriages. They were afraid they would lose access to their property if they left. They feared that they would lose access to their economic possessions if they left. But more importantly, they also feared that leaving the marriage meant leaving or giving up their only access to their communities, which is their access to their cultural heritage. When these women reached out to services, particularly generalist and statutory services, they were often asked, but why can't you leave? You are not reliant on your partner. You have secure immigration status. You are a citizen. You are educated. You are property owning. Why can't you leave? These women could not leave. And more importantly, they could not explain why they could not leave. When I asked these women what would be the most valuable form of support for them, or in this situation, what would have been the most valuable form of support for them, they talked about the need for peer support. They said, if only I had been able to speak to a woman who is from a similar cultural background as me, who speaks my language, who understands where I'm coming from, whom I do not need to explain to my circumstances over and over again. Instance, and what these victims said, and not only in my research, but research across the country, highlights the absolute need for specialist buy-in for support services for minoritized women experiencing gender violence across the UK. This is particularly relevant to the east of England. I'm sitting in Cambridge today in this Women's Parliament. This is a region of the country where Asian communities and minoritized communities as well have had long histories of settlement. If you look at the Asian community, which is the largest ethnic minority community in this region of the country, they've been living here since the 1950s. However, Asian women and minoritized women as a whole are visibly underrepresented in local politics and policy making. They are notably absent. Therefore, I call at the local, regional, national level. And I call upon our government here in the east of England, at the council level, at the regional level as well. We must do more to support women from vulnerable sections in our society. I suggest two things that we could do as participants of the electoral process, but also calling on the governments as well. We need to promote the leadership of minoritized women, particularly in services and local authorities. Victims will come forward when they see women who look like them, speaking up for them. The second thing I recommend is that all governments at every level should have allocated, sustained funding for specialist for services. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a particularly adverse impact on these services, and they're still scrambling to recover. This is when governments need to step in. And this is when they need to do much more than they are doing to be able to protect the most vulnerable women in our society. I support the Women's Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Myrna Gua. Thank you. And now I call on Stephanie Palmer to address us. Thank you, Stephanie.
The United States CDC highlights income inequality as being one of the main societal factors contributing to domestic violence against women. CEDAW's Article 11 also requires the right to equal remuneration. Why then is the wage gap still an issue of modern society in the United Kingdom? The gender pay gap is an ever-present inequality that places women in a disadvantaged economic position. According to the National Education Union, 1/5 of women are of persistently low income. As a result of this disparity, women are often forced to rely on a male partner financially, which can create an imbalance in power and put them at risk of abuse. Women in households of low income are 3.5 times more likely to experience domestic violence than women of higher income. Women's Aid research has shown that 96% of women who have experienced abuse are struggling financially. The natural conclusion to be drawn from such harrowing statistics is that poverty traps women into abusive households they cannot escape from due to financial barriers. This has been exacerbated further by the cost of living crisis, so women have lost even more financial independence by not even being able to afford basic essentials for themselves and their children. While women's employment rate is at an all-time high in the UK, women make up 60% of employees on low pay and 73% of part-time workers, often due to caring responsibilities and unaffordable childcare. As previously stated, Article 11 of CEDAW requires equal remuneration, and while the UK has ratified this convention, the gender pay gap has remained at around 18% over the last 2 decades, with the gap being even wider for BAME women and disabled women. The consequences of this are significant. Women become trapped in abusive households because they do not possess the financial power to leave the home. Even if they do find a way to leave, they will likely fall into poverty along with their children. Often women will need to get away from the area where their abuser lives, which means leaving their place of work and moving somewhere new. If women are on benefits, this means making a renewed claim, which can take up to 5 weeks to be paid out. Women make up the majority of people receiving welfare benefits, yet universal credit is only paid into one bank account, which can interfere with women's economic independence and make them vulnerable to financial abuse. These are only a few examples to make clear that the Department for Work and Pensions continues to disregard the issue of gender inequality in their policymaking. The DWP must start including women's safety in their decision-making and recognize that the impact of such inequality is detrimental and only puts women at a higher risk of exploitation and abuse. Affordable childcare must be introduced and flexible working must become the norm to put an end to women's disadvantages in the workplace. 97% of domestic abuse survivors were subject to coercive control of their finances, whether that be interference with the woman's employment or financial exploitation. It is without a doubt that economic inequality is a key vulnerability that enables abusive men to take advantage of. The budget cuts back in 2010 have had a disproportionately worsening effect on women over the years and made it even more difficult for them to make a livable income and retain economic independence. CEDAW clearly demands that policies must not be discriminatory in effect, which is not reflected in the UK today. We cannot claim to be a modern society that stands for equality while continuing continuing to ignore the wage gap and allow women to be trapped in abusive homes. I second the motion. Thank you.
And thank you, Stephanie Palmer. And I'd now like to call on Anna Serrano. Anna.
Look, some people struggle to understand what is coercive control. This is because even survivors of coercive control struggle to explain what is it like. Recently, I found a good analogy describing coercive control. Allow me to read. If a situation of coercive control were a political system, it will be a dictatorship. The coercive control perpetrator is the dictator. Dictators able to behave with deceptive politeness on the international stage are defined by cruel, ruthless, and paranoid tyranny over their own people. Domestic opposition is usually banned. Contact with people from other countries heavily restricted. Citizens are likely to be under constant surveillance. Compliance is instilled through terror and threat of punishment. In other words, live with a coercive control perpetrator is like living under one of the most oppressive governments on earth. And there are millions of these mini dictatorships happening right now on ordinary streets. Quite probably, if you live in one, in your street too. These are a few words from the book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Life from Emma Katz. Survivors and victims of domestic abuse live under a constant state of terror. Their entire life revolves around how to avoid the next threat, the next conflict, or the next punishment. There is no space to think about ordinary life matters like if it's going to rain, or if you're starting a new job, or if your children will pass today's exam. The entire everyday is about making sure that dinner is on the table at the exact time. Make sure that nobody knocks the door or phones or texts once he's there. Make sure your children do not shout or play around when he's around. Make sure that he doesn't know you bought a new pair of shoes for your children. Make sure you don't say the wrong word. Make sure you don't breathe too loud or in the wrong direction. And no matter how much they do, it's never enough. There are no boundaries. The dictator needs to assert his control by constantly changing the laws and the law enforcement to make you feel like you are a criminal and that you don't know where to stand. The dictator will make you feel like you are constantly breaking the law because rules are constantly changing. Do you know where you stand? The dictator will constantly remind you of that, often with violence. At this point, survivors will suddenly move into a fight, flight, or freeze mode. We all have been there at some point in our lives. You are driving and suddenly someone crosses the road. Your child injures themselves and you have to run to the hospital. How do you feel after these moments of sudden emergency? So now just try to imagine these moments several times a day, day after day, with no break, no space to recover, to heal, or to think. There is no space for anything else than to try to avoid the next one, which you know is coming, but you don't know when. I don't know you, but I feel suffocation just to think about it. A permanent state of fear and exhaustion. And then survivors have to hear from friends, family, and professionals things like, why don't you just leave? Stop asking this question is an insult to the survivor. The survivor did not choose to be abused, neither they choose to live in terror. Who made this decision? The dictator. Only they should be made accountable and questioned for their action. Enough to judge the survivors, enough to question them, and enough of protecting a criminal. We need to be more proactive on challenging the language used around domestic abuse and violence against women. We need to start to challenge sexism and misogyny in a constructive manner, respectfully, challenging the statement and not the person, but assertively, there and then. Don't be a bystander. Recently, I was told by a white middle-aged man that this change needs to be done slowly and carefully, as we will not get anywhere shaming people. Let me be clear. No, sir. First of all, the dignity of manhood should not be a priority when we have women being terrorized, raped, and murdered on an everyday basis. And second, if your statement has been called out and you feel ashamed, maybe it's because you should feel ashamed. Look, we all have been raised in a patriarchal society. and we have to challenge ourselves to grow. Being called out and feeling embarrassment about our own behavior is part of the learning process. It takes courage and it is brave to acknowledge our mistakes. It isn't easy, but this is how change happens in society. Stop justifying dictators, stop protecting them, and stand against the dictatorship of domestic abuse. So yeah, I support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna Serrano. And now let's come to Julie O'Shea. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. At the University of Buckingham, I work with a diverse group of law students offering vocational work experience opportunities. In particular, I encourage female students to gain as much career experience as they can with law firms, barristers' chambers, and volunteering through pro bono organisations and charities to enhance access to justice. This experience can have a tremendous impact in real terms. For the individual female student, showcasing evidence of their clinical work experience often provides, in simple terms, a welcome boost of confidence and often leads on to more significant impact, helping them to stand out from their peers, the competitive law graduate crowd. But perhaps most importantly of all, in psychological terms, it engages students with real life problems and legal casework, which can help kickstart the female student into thinking of themselves as independent economic operators, establishing themselves as future facilitators of change for the benefit of vulnerable members of society and other organisations in the community. One example of how my work has led to long-term individual and lasting impact for students is the transformative clinic collaboration with the Citizens Advice. This project has run for several years as an extracurricular activity, providing outreach facilities for free independent clinic sessions run by students and supervised by the charity. Often this will be the student's first endeavour into the world of work, speaking to a client in need of help and assisting members of the general public in the local community. The success of this project has led to a new clinic module being embedded into the law degree at Buckingham, which starts next year through the support of the Citizens Advice Milton Keynes. Students will spend 1 day per week in term time working alongside volunteers at CAMK, assisting with a range of client inquiry areas involving family, property and debt disputes. Not uncommon are often underlying elements of coercive control and domestic violence. By gaining experience in multiple client inquiry areas and developing multi-dimensional transferable skills, the law student learns to become a well-rounded, client-centered and culturally sensitive individual serving their community. One of the other highlights of my work this year has been the development of the placement programme in private legal practice. Students now have the opportunity to apply to work as interns for a year at a family law firm called Southgate Solicitors, receiving training in family client services, including the beginning and ending of a relationship, children advice, and domestic violence. By immersing the student into the realities of legal practice helps the student to develop their client lawyering skills, but more importantly, creates that all-important bond of trust between the advisor and the client in the most sensitive arena of private client work. It enhances the student's belief in their ability as an advisor to listen and help address their client's safety and support needs to ultimately achieve freedom from violence. By embracing public service and helping real people face the hardships of life, I believe the university and the Citizens Advice Clinic work can give female students the opportunity to evaluate the benefits and limits of various interventions in the complex problems of domestic violence. Other vocational work, such as visits to the local magistrates court, also introduces students to the support mechanisms provided by the witness service, so they can see firsthand the impact this practical and emotional support can provide. This work can often inspire students to engage in the work of the magistracy and in community education, or even instigate policy advocacy projects. By the time these young women go out into the workplace, they have received a wealth of diverse experiences to empower them and to establish and support the growth of their economic independence. And I support this motion through the clinical legal education work at Buckingham. I hope more empowered women will join forces to bring about systematic change within the legal and associated professions to advance women's economic independence and to end violence against women. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie O'Shea. And now may I call on Chiquita Alterbridge. Chiquita, thank you.
Thank you. Legal or litigation abuse is a form of abuse that really encompasses multiple forms of abuse as it pertains to violence against women. It is a special kind of torment that for the most part goes unchecked and unchallenged, particularly in the family court system. For abusers, it is all about power and control, but for their victims, it is about survival. As we know, intimate partner violence morphs into post-separation abuse, and litigation abuse is one of the most common tactics used by abusers. Litigation abuse is a special kind of hell because you are forced into an adversarial situation, facing an opponent who can induce fear, make you recall trauma, and who you know is capable of violence, be it emotional, physical, financial, etc. And you have to face them over and over again. Whether it be divorce proceedings or child custody disputes, it can be a never-ending and costly battle. Legal abuse has a distinct intersectionality. It's emotional, psychological, and financial, and can be a form of coercive control. Instead of the fist or words or the palm of the hand being what hits you, it's a blow from the judicial system. If there are children involved, you are doing a life sentence without committing any crime. Yet your abuser can have control over aspects of your life with unintended assistance from the court. The reality is that a poor judgment can ruin or even end you or your children's lives, as we've seen time and time again. The courts must recognize that when abuse is involved in familial matters, the way that abusers have access to see you, harass you, and remind you that there is no escape can be through litigation. It is a reminder that they can always get to you, and the child or children are collateral damage. A space where children's welfare is paramount. Should this not be recognized for what it is? Why are judges reluctant to put protocols in place to prevent the misuse of the family court system, particularly against women? Why are people who are abusive to women not considered a danger to children as well? The reason could be that abusers often have multiple personalities, at minimum 2. I call it the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde syndrome. Why? Because the person who shows up in court is Dr. Jekyll, charming, charismatic, presenting the very best of themselves, and puts on a very convincing act. However, Mr. Hyde is who the courts do not see, but is who the victim or survivor knows all too well. Someone with no conscience or consideration for who or what they hurt, as long as they get what they want. It's scary how often that ploy works. It's amazing how often Darbo tactics work in their favor. This makes family court a living, never-ending nightmare. For many, appearing in court or getting summoned to court triggers anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. It impacts on your behaviors at work and in the home because it is emotionally and mentally draining. If you need legal advice or representation, it puts a strain on the financial resources that you do have and has the potential to put you into debt or in a place where you cannot afford legal representation. It impacts your financial independence. Psychologically, you live in a constant state of fight or flight, only for any concerns that you have for the welfare of yourself and of your children to be put to the side or ignored in favor of children need both parents. I wholeheartedly disagree with this. What children need are whole, healthy, healed, safe, and stable parents who prioritize them. What they do not need is to witness one parent being dragged through court for often frivolous, unfounded, and unproven allegations time and time again. Continuous applications and appeals are abuse. While it can be acknowledged that there is a need to uphold one's access to justice, there also needs to be recognition that one's right to justice should not give them the access or right to abuse women. Because of the beliefs and experience of myself and those who I know with domestic abuse and its impacts, I second this motion in hopes that these ongoing concerns can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chiquita Alterbridge. And now may we come to Anna Kavit. Anna.
Good afternoon. We talk about the violence against women, and I must say that sadly, this is the reality familiar to women across the world. As I'm coming from Ukraine, I would like to share some insight about one of the forms of violence against women Ukrainian women are experiencing right now, conflict-related sexual violence. It is known that during wars, rates of all forms of violence increase, that they all are interrelated, that women are more exposed to them. But sexual violence as a weapon of war is an outrageous act of violence against women. It is brutal violation of human rights and women's rights, of criminal laws and of the laws of war. During the ongoing Russia's war against Ukraine, Russian military are raping Ukrainian women and children in the occupied territories, sometimes till death. Such cases are being recorded officially by the police. The majority of victims of conflict-related sexual violence are women. They are being raped, forcefully impregnated, and used as sexual slaves. Their bodies and lives became battlefields and means for terrorizing populations and the government. Despite the outrageous character of this crime, why we know so little about these cases? Why was it recognized as a weapon of war only in 2008, while women have been falling victims of CRSV during the wars across the world for years? First of all, because these crimes are largely invisible. Women rarely report cases of sexual violence, not only because it is a traumatic experience, but also because survivors of CRSV are usually highly stigmatized. Despite all the horrors of these crimes, unfortunately, society usually has more skeptical comments and questions to the survivors than to perpetrators, which is an act of violence towards the survivor itself. Society still tends to put responsibility on survivors, on the language they use, on clothes they were wearing, and time of the day they were outside. The second reason is these crimes are invisible because many of victims do not survive them. And this crime receives less attention also because violence against women is a structural problem that happens in all societies on a daily basis. Although the severity of this problem is different across the countries. Misogyny, discrimination of women, treating them as a lower quality people, less valuable people, not intervening into the private life, and conflict between husband and wife, or men and women, and impunity for violence against women at national and international level contribute to the proliferation of sexual violence during the war. Because if violence is a part of a man's daily life, it is likely they will commit acts of violence, including sexual violence, during the war when the law and order break down. Toleration of violence leads to more violence in crisis situations. And what I want to say with it, when women are assaulted at streets at home, raped during wars, when they are systematically paid less, when they are the first to lose jobs in situations of crisis, when policies aimed at combating violence against women are not adopted and are not implemented, and when all these acts of violence and discrimination are invisible and tolerated, this is violence not only at an individual, but also violence at level, but also violence committed by the society and by the state. CEDAW tells us that discrimination can be formal and informal, direct and indirect, which means it can happen at the level of laws, but also at the level of norm. It is very important to advance the laws and policies, but it is also crucial to change the habit, the mindset, and the understanding of what violence is in order to prevent the violence against women at all levels and to prevent the devastating consequences it can lead to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Anna Kavit, thank you. And now I'd like to call upon Dr. Cynthia Umazaliki. Cynthia, thank you.
Today, I will be speaking on the role of women, economic status in the way they accept and normalize violence, particularly focused on African and ethnic minorities. As a human rights lawyer and activist, it is important I start by making my first statement. Violence against women is a fundamental human rights issue, and I categorically condemn all forms of violence against women and girls, which continues to impact on their right to life, their right not to be tortured or treated in an inhuman and degrading way, their right to respect for family and private life, their right to not be discriminated against. It is also important that I start by relaying some key facts. 35% of women in sub-Saharan Africa would experience intimate partner violence, which is 5% more likely than the global average. According to the World Bank, 51% of African women report that being beaten by their husband is justified if they either go out without permission, neglect the children, argue back, burn the food, or refuse to have sex. A multi-country study by the World Health Organization in Sub-Saharan Africa revealed that sexual violence is at a high in countries like Zambia, with reported cases reaching 90%, and Ethiopia 71%. Data from the Gender Equality Index report on reproductive health, employment, and empowerment states that 27 of the 30 countries in the world that exhibits inequitable gender violence are in Africa. 78% of African women live below poverty lines, and according to the UN, poverty can increase violence, and impoverished women are exposed and subjected to higher levels of violence. Now, I make my second statement. The most vulnerable, disregarded, disrespected, and violated person is an African woman with no money, education, employment, assets, or access to resources. Economic equality and safety from all forms of violence are not separate issues. They are mutually compatible. I make this statement boldly, or as Nigerians would say, with my full chest, having spent my formative years in Nigeria, West Africa, where the economic system is deliberately built to ensure that women are relegated to the background and remain domesticated, invariably stripping them of economic independence. This fencing system places men as the head of the household and workforce, thereby allowing them monopolize and weaponize resources distribution, undermining employment, and financially exploiting these women. The fewer economic resources women has access to in terms of sustainable assets, job security, or education, the more dependent they are on the men. The power imbalance is dominant in impoverished communities where women are groomed to tolerate, accept, and normalize all forms of violence. When ethnic minority women with no economic status experience violence, they have no cause of action, as most of these communities are detached from the central government or the laws that prohibit violence against women. In looking at the way African and ethnic minorities women experience violence, we must highlight the lack of economic status and independence is a reason they accept and normalize violence at work and in the workplace. I am therefore reminded of Chinonye, a 22-year-old young woman living in a remote village in Udi, eastern Nigeria. She is uneducated, earns less than $10 a month, working in a breadfruit farm. She is forced into early marriage by her family, where she experiences physical, sexual, and mental violence.
At the farm, she's also abused but accepts violence, beatings as part of the work life. Chinonye refuses to leave the marriage or job and accepts this way of life until her sudden death. In reading about Chinonye's story, I am reminded of Eleanor Roosevelt's profound statement that human rights must begin in small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Chinonye lived in those small places, so close to home. Finally, I make my last statement. Today, I speak for Chinonye. I speak for Aisha, Ketura Opeyemi, Dimakatu Adogo, and all those African and ethnic minority women living in very remote villages and regions. No education, employment, or assets, and sadly, their only option is to accept violence as a way of life. We need community-based interventions that dismantle the structural fencing system and improve women's economic status through education, safe and gainful employment, and legal protections. We have to also think about dismantling the mental element. How do we break the psychological and cultural barriers that has imprisoned them to accept violence as a way of life? Perhaps the Women's Bill of Rights can offer these women in small places close to home, real hope in reclaiming the rights to their bodies, well-being, improved economic status, and independence. I support this motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia Umazaliki. Thank you. And now may I call on Claire Reeve. Claire.
ADHD affects over 1.5 million adults in the UK, yet only 4.9% of women will be diagnosed in their lifetime, compared to 12% of men. Many females with neurodiverse conditions such as autism or ADHD are often better at masking, present as less aggressive, and can be inattentive and dreamy. This makes getting assessment and diagnosis difficult, as I've personally found for both my now diagnosed autistic daughter and myself. According to the UK ADHD Centre, many women in today's society often feel pressures in the family to look after the children, provide a good home environment, be in a happy relationship, and hold down a job. When a woman has ADHD, adopting and integrating these different roles and responsibilities can be very challenging. Society can also be less forgiving of women who struggle with these tasks, unlike their male counterparts who might be excused as being charmingly messy and disorganized. There are also other disorders that can occur along with ADHD in women. These complications may cause trouble in correctly diagnosing the existence of ADHD, so an expert clinician needs to be aware of the existence of these possible comorbidities. Eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder, depression and anxiety, sleeping disorder, substance abuse, drugs, or alcohol. I was a high achieving pupil academically, but lack of focus meant I burnt out quickly. I truanted a lot, became promiscuous, smoked, drank, and eventually became hooked on amphetamine speed following high school. Speed is very similar to the effects of ADHD medication. I never felt high, but it did give me more alertness and the energy to go to college or work and get through the day. Taking drugs made me feel crushingly guilty and ashamed of myself, and I felt weakened. But self-medicating can be common for those with ADHD, as we need to release the brain chemicals such as endorphins and serotonin that affect focus and attention. These brain chemicals are in short supply in those with ADHD. I had abusive relationships with men from the age of 12. My ex-husband was coercive and controlling and emotionally abusive, and I began to binge drink at weekends. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous briefly, but felt a fraud. Many there drank 24/7 and I didn't. And he said his job was more important than mine because he earned more as an electrician. And I was a childcare professional by then. I had jobs in schools, nurseries, social services, and schools library services. And I didn't let my private life interfere with work, but I was struggling. We got a mortgage, and this was paid through my ex-husband's bank account, as we didn't have a joint account. Although I paid for all the bills, electric, gas, food shopping, council tax, but he liked to boast to everyone about how he pays the mortgage without mentioning what I pay for. And in reality, it was just a payment that went out of his bank account. He liked to exploit my feelings of low self-worth. particularly after I left him. He'd tell people how he paid for my house, and he still does, even though we'd only had a mortgage together for 4 years, and I've now been paying a mortgage myself for the last 13. He emigrated 6 years ago, leaving our autistic daughter in my care. He hasn't seen her in 5 years. He was the one who appeared solid and stable on the outside, whereas I didn't. And the toll of emotional violence and control during that time was severe. And I didn't see many friends or family, whilst I also felt trapped inside the prison of my ADHD brain and in chronic pain, a lot of the time due to also having spina bifida. Trying to appear neurotypical for ADHD women is often difficult. Social skills are sometimes good, sometimes not. We often talk excessively or not at all and can be completely mute. ADHD is extreme. You function at 100% or 0%. There is no in between. It can be a state of constant panic, struggling to get tasks finished. We can have several tabs open at once in our brains, thoughts that never stop. I can't sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm up at 7 o'clock every morning. I truly believe that I've never been able to reach my full potential, and so many other ADHD women say the same thing. This leads to feelings of inadequacy and never feeling comfortable in her own skin. There is no peace with ADHD, and this is why diagnosis and treatment is so crucial. With more information on the internet and in books on women with autism and ADHD, increasing numbers of women are self-diagnosing in adulthood, but this knowledge hasn't yet properly transferred to public health and education services. After an incredible amount of research, I self-diagnosed ADHD around 15, 20 years ago. I went through the mental health department at Ealing Hospital after a distressing fight with my GP to refer me. I was misdiagnosed with an anxiety disorder, prescribed antidepressants and sent on my way. I did have anxiety, but this was just an effect of the real underlying cause. And 15 years later, I'm now on a waiting list again. I have been for nearly a year. A friend has recently told me she's been waiting for 2 years and has been told it could be another 6 to 18 months before she even gets an appointment. This is outrageous, sisters. 3.5 years in the system before even getting an initial appointment. The number of women with ADHD social media groups has mushroomed. Women saying the same things, unable to focus, find energy, with low self-esteem, processing issues, poor social skills, and feeling inadequate as mothers or within colleges or workplaces. Not all of these women will have ADHD, but they need an assessment, proper triaging to find out. The lack of healthcare available to neurodiverse women is a form of violence. The aggressive pathway to assessment and diagnosis is violent. Even the name attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is violent. Negative terms like deficit and disorder. I have great attention to tasks that interest me with my hyper-focus and determination to see some things through. However, I can appear unorganized in the patriarchal society that we live in. The man's world designed to control the masses, particularly women. My scattered brain has its benefits, and I can sometimes get several tasks done at once whilst being interested in a vast variety of things and being willing to explore and see outside the box. But sometimes this means burnout, and society still sadly judges women like me. My mum and my grandmother both had similar traits, and according to a meta-analysis of twin studies, the heritability of ADHD is estimated at 77 to 88%. There are also intersectional issues, including religion, race, sexuality, and class, which will also complicate the impacts of ADHD on women. According to the ADHD UK Centre, just as different as we are as individuals, people with ADHD have different milestones and challenges to overcome, depending on their age and gender. Untreated and undiagnosed ADHD may have a critical impact on a woman's mental, physical, and social avenues. It's of utter importance that women with ADHD be accurately diagnosed and receive ADHD treatments that will suit their lifestyle and can address the symptoms to enable them to flourish. Finally, I call on sisters present to support ADHD women because we are vulnerable to violence in our homes, workplace, schools, and colleges. We can be abused sexually, economically, and mentally. ADHD in women must be recognised and taken seriously. Thank you very much. I support the motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire Reid. And now may I call on Rebecca Dennis. Rebecca.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Dennis. I used to work in this building for the City Council, and I left 21 years ago almost to the day to have my first baby. I'm very pleased to be back here today. I'm going to talk about incidents that happened when I lived and worked in London. I'm calling it stalking. I'm not sure it is, but you can judge for yourselves. I was in charge of the contracts in the organisation where I worked, ensuring that they were tendered or retendered according to government rules. I worked in a busy open plan office, but I was lucky because I could go to a far quieter place, the stationery store. One day I was working there along with 2 contractors. They were chatting away as they went about their task, and suddenly one of them said, "Sex." The word got through my concentration zone, but I assumed they were just sort of sharing an anecdote and didn't think too much of it. But then it was repeated, "Sex." I couldn't help but look round. The actor who'd uttered it looked at me, then he returned to his work and I do mine. Then I heard it again, "Sex." He seemed to want to provoke me, and I was cross. I packed up my stuff and went back upstairs to tell my boss, who immediately sprang into action. Within no time, the head of department had met with the contractor's boss, and the contractor was dismissed from site. I was rather dizzy by the speed of events and concerned on hearing that the dismissal from site also meant the contractor being let go, sacked, as there were no other projects for him to work on. Nonetheless, I thought I'd probably done the right thing. I forgot about it. Some months later, I moved into a new flat, a rented flat. My flatmate was a legal secretary. She volunteered as a special police officer. The flat was owned by a woman working in the creative industry. It was beautiful, and I was very happy there. Out of the blue, strange things began to happen. The telephone wire was cut. A milk bottle was filled with what appeared to be urine. We heard noises outside, rustling of bushes in the night. I was convinced someone had seen my flatmate go out in her police uniform from the flat and hadn't liked the look of it. One night I heard something appear to hit my window. It was a ground floor flat and both our bedrooms had patio doors onto the garden. I didn't think much of the noise, but it happened again, and I realized they were missiles, and I couldn't think anymore that it was just someone's cat visiting. Met police officers came to check it out, telling me that the windows should be covered with proper curtains, not the tasteful and insubstantial arrangements that were there. Not my decorations, I protested, but I took the victim blaming. It wasn't my flatmate who was the target. Her windows remained untouched, despite being easier to get to. The last night I slept there, I walked into my bedroom to find the double-glazed patio window smashed into 1,000 pieces. Someone had hit it with an almighty force. Then I was scared. I called my flatmate, and that's the last thing I remember. I seemed to melt into a meltdown. The next day I moved out. Many, many years later, I linked the 2 events. Contractor had followed me home and persistently attacked my home, seeking revenge. That was my conjecture, but who else could it have been? That's the end of my story, but I need to end the talk. I do that with a reflection, which is simply this. Had I been naive? I reported the contractor. He was punished. He was meant to realize he was wrong and stop doing it. But it didn't seem to work out that way. But unless those women who can do report violence, it will not end. I support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca Dennis. Thank you. And now I'd like to pass to Kate Biscardi. Thank you, Kate.
Right, change of tack now, back to some statistics. And I do commend to anyone who's interested in national trends and so on, the ONS data on gender pay gap, which gives us some wonderful trends right the way back from 1997 and beyond, if you dig further. The latest figures, they do ask us to look at with caution because of the impact of COVID and furlough and so on the data. But what we have shows some quite remarkable differences. The situation overall, and when I say overall, I do mean not just in COVID times, but the overall situation does seem to be improving with a decrease in the pay gap overall, but it does hide some serious inequalities. The biggest gap is actually in the top dectile, where men's earnings are 15.5% higher than women's. Or I should say women's earnings are 15.5% less than men's because the base is men's pay. But at the bottom dectile, it's actually only 3%. So there's this huge inequality at the top, which may not seem terribly significant, but it's important to remember that these women in these top positions, Linda mentioned when she was talking about WASPI that there were only 2 women in cabinet at the time. Women at the top of organizations have a disproportionate effect upon the likelihood of women throughout the organization being treated more fairly. This goes back to point 3 in the motion itself, of course, that national and the private sector recognise their responsibility and roles in ending violence against women, and part of that goes back to economic independence, and there actually being women at the top. So it's not just that there aren't as many women at the top, but those who are there aren't earning as much as the men. Now, the pay gap is smallest in Northern Ireland and biggest in Southeast England and London, where the pay gap is the only region where the pay gap is similar in most recent figures to 1997. And those latter 2 regions are the ones where long commutes are common. And this is something that I don't think anybody has really thought that much about. But women seem to favour shorter commutes if they're asked what they would rather have, a longer commute for more money. Men and women will react very differently. Men will take the long commute for the more money, and women will take the shorter commute for less money, which of course impacts on on long-term earnings and ultimately on pensions. And it's caused because of the need for childcare, and there has been much discussion elsewhere here about the costs of childcare and the impact on women. We can see this in the figures if we look across the time scale. In 1997, the gap for 22 to 29-year-olds was only minus 5.8%. Women appeared to be catching up with men when in the older age groups, the gap was much bigger. It seemed things were improving, but if you come to the more recent figures, the cohort of 40 to 49-year-olds, i.e. almost the same people, that the gap then was 13.7%. So that is the impact of childcare, having a family, starting a family, women being less likely to move into higher paid managerial levels, which really shows up in the gap after 40. So I think we really need to think about not just women's pay overall, but where the inequalities are and why they arise. And it does seem to come back to a large extent to the disproportionate burden that childcare and unpaid domestic responsibilities have for women rather than men. And I'm not sure what we can do about that. But I support the motion.
Thank you, Kate. Actually, if I could just intercede here, The Authority Gap by Marianne Seagert actually picks up that issue really of the differential between women at the top and men, because women are not given the same recognition of authority and power, and that leads to, I think, this differential, of course, on top of the issue of childcare, as you've raised, Kate. Thank you. Now, I'd like to now call on Dr. Davina Lloyd. Davina, please.
Thank you, Jocelynne, and thank you all the other contributors this morning. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm a 1950s woman, and I've suffered discrimination the whole of my life, and hence support wholeheartedly the motion and the implementation of CEDAW. I'm going to speak to point 11 on the motion, but I wish to say beforehand that I've been asked by the founder of back260.com to represent them here at this Parliament. And they, of course, as you know, have done an awful lot of work with CEDAW. Now, what I would like to say, I'm getting feedback. I'm hoping you're not getting the feedback as well. In line with what's already been said about misogyny against women, Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Austerity, says two different things. One, in terms of the 3.8 million women who had their pensions stolen from them, that it was unconscionable for the government to treat women in this way. And secondly, that in terms of misogyny, if you were to take a group of misogynists, put them in a room and ask them to come up with ideas, laws, whatever, that would discriminate against women, you would probably end up with what we've got already today. And I think that says a lot about why we are where we are. We also need to look at it in the context of that men have been treated differently the whole time, and that it is women who are singled out, as the 1950s women were singled out, to be treated differently. So at the same time as my cohort of women, the 1950s women, were being told without notice that you have to work another 5-6 years before you get your pension, 9.8 million men were given the opportunity to retire early by having their national insurance contributions paid for them. And women weren't actually told very much at all about these changes until it affected men, with the change from 65 to 60. So when men are in the equation, the government starts to do things. And we're back again to the issues of misogyny. Lots have been said about the unequal pay. I think I said the other day, Jocelynne, that there was an announcement, I think November the 17th, that because of the unequal pay issue, women are working from now till the end of the year without effectively being paid because of the pay gap. And that pay gap leads to a pension pay gap. And the pension pot for the cohort that I work with is 1/5 of the pension pot of men, simply because of all the things that have happened in the past that have meant that women have not been able to build up their pension pots. And so what's really important at the moment is that we do get a Women's Bill of Rights, and we bring in CEDAW. And what is interesting for those who may not know, I was the NGO representative at Geneva for Back260 for a couple of years. And the CEDAW committee will hold our government to account next year for the progress it's made against the recommendations in 2019. Now, those recommendations included recommendations on women's pensions, women's pay, childcare arrangements, and violence against women. Unfortunately, the report card for our government is not good. And when they were examined in 2018, they had only met 23% of the previous recommendations from 4 or 5 years previously. And what is notable, that one of the witnesses to the tribunal that we held this July was Dr. Elgin Safarov, and he is the vice chair of the CEDAW committee in Geneva, and he is in no doubt how much our government has to do to meet its obligations to women and girls. It appears at the moment that our government is not ashamed of the breaches that it has to international law such as CEDAW. We have signed up to it, and therefore we are legally obliged to adhere to it, even if it hasn't gone through the full ratification. And the singling out of the 1950s born women to bear the brunt, really, of this equalisation plan of state pensions ages is irrefutably discrimination. It irrefutably breaks all the articles of CEDAW, and those women must be returned to the position they would have been in prior to those changes taking place. And this was clearly stated by Meg Hillier as well, who is the chair of the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee. And in January 2021, in referring to another DWP misstep, if we can call it that, she said very clearly that departments that make errors through maladministration have a duty to put those it wronged back in the position they should have been. Now, the CEDAW People's Tribunal, as I said, this July concluded that direct discrimination against women had taken place. This report was taken to number 10 Downing Street on the 1st of November. And it was published online yesterday, so you're all welcome to look at it and to see what needs to be done. And on behalf of the tribunal, the CEDAW in Law People's Tribunal, I would like to share with you this letter to the Prime Minister. And please note that the Right Honourable Rishi Sunak has the power to overturn the UK Supreme Court's out-of-time decision in the discrimination matter regarding 1950s women, utilising the dissenting opinion inherent in the judge's report where direct discrimination is found. And there is other examples of this. It goes as follows. Dear Prime Minister, direct discrimination. The CEDAW in Law People's Tribunal 2022 and its patrons calls on behalf of the 1950s women victims for you to meet in due haste with the judge as per her personal earlier invitation. An opportunity to overturn the Wednesbury unreasonableness of the UK Supreme Court's paper thin, as a matter of public opinion, decision now presents itself, since indeed the court itself indicated the matter was a parliamentary one. Favourable consideration to a free vote in this matter of conscience to meet the debt of honour, as the opposition has called it, will settle the moral issue. As you will be aware, one appropriate parliamentary mechanism is a temporary special measure, which is Erskine May proof and has been used successfully in the past. A general election is becoming ever more likely, and the voting bloc in question is mobilised to protect its interest. Please be advised that the legal challenge has been identified in the said matter, and explorative dialogue with the CEDAW Committee, Geneva, is underway. We look forward to your response as a matter of high priority. And that's sent on behalf of Joanne Welsh, the founder of the CEDAW in Law People's Tribunal, and the patrons, Dr. Nazir Afzal, OBE, KC, Ian Byrne, MP, Professor John Cooper, KC, David Henke, Dr. Charlotte Proudman, Sam Smethers, and our academic consultant, Lord Prem Seeker. So what we're asking for is a call for action, that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition now have the perfect opportunity to return the earned dues of those 1950s women. And it's about time. The whole way through this proceedings, we've been talking about time. How long have we been waiting for various things to happen? We need a Women's Bill of Rights now. While we're waiting for that to go through Parliament, let's have a temporary special measure to at least address one of the issues. And that issue is the 1950s women's pension scandal. And it is a scandal that these women have been discriminated in this way. And again, if we're talking about finances, if women cannot be financially independent then all the other things that we've been talking about today regarding violence and poverty and everything else also happen. We have to do something now. I support the motion wholeheartedly and call for action now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Davina Lloyd, Dr. Davina Lloyd. I'd just like to conclude on this note before we second the motion and agree to the motion. Back in 1793, Edward Christian, who was the editor at that time of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, said, "I fear there is little reason to pay a compliment to our laws for their respect and favour to the female sex." He was saying that because Blackstone had put the proposition in his work that women were the favoured group within society because of the rule of coverture. The rule of coverture was that the man, the husband, controlled everything, that once a woman and man were married, there was one person, and that person was the husband, and the wife was covered by the husband. That was the rule of coverture. And Edward Christian, in 1793, that the Blackstone's Commentaries was first published in 1753, and 40 years later, in 1793, Edward Christian could see that it was false to say that women were advantaged by the laws of England. And then we come to 1995, Race, Gender and Power in America, when Judith Resnick, in her chapter in that book, From the Senate Judiciary Commission to the County Courthouse, the relevance of gender, race and ethnicity to adjudication, said this: "The temptation to avert one's eyes from seeing the ways in which gender, race, ethnicity, class and sexual orientation frame judgments is powerful. What does one do in the face of pervasive gendered and racialized interpretations of fact, of credibility and of legal doctrine? How does one run the court system?" And having heard the issues that were raised today, particularly in relation to the pensions gap, one could and should add age to that list of gender, race, ethnicity, class and sexual orientation. This fits in with the issues that are raised by every woman here in this Women's Parliament, and particularly in relation to age and the pensions gap, which must be focused on, because women are not going to be economically independent until that pensions gap is closed. And the pensions gap won't ever close so long as all the other issues that have been raised by women here are in existence. That is, the issues of childcare, the issues of violence against women, the issues in that regard of coercive control, of stalking, of assault, of rape in the community of women who in their ordinary and everyday lives simply want to live a life that's free, where we can walk on the streets, where we can go into our homes and live in our homes without the existence of the rapist within the home also, as well as on the street. So I now put the motion that is before this Women's Parliament, and I call for everybody present to second the motion. Is the motion seconded? I see all the hands rising and indicating that the motion is seconded, and therefore it is passed. I now close this Parliament with thanks to Eleanor Redshaw, Janet Robertson, Dr. Natalie Turney, Carolyn Blazczak, Linda Edwards-Shea, Saffron Anderton, Dr. Myrna Guer, Stephanie Palmer, Anna Serrano, Baljit Banger, who unfortunately was to be here but was unable to attend, Julie O'Shea, Dr. Cynthia Azaliki, Claire Reeve, Rebecca Dennis, Anna Kivett, Trika Outerbridge, and also Kate Viscardi and Dr. Davina Lloyd. I now close this Parliament. Thank you.